Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. Today we're going to share some trip horror stories. First story. There's only 5 of us on this camping trip. We keep counting 6. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space. Faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school, and we're celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together, and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them, hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother, as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us, including me, and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had wanted to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric wanted to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down, yet my head seemed to just stop working as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration, except 4. "It's all right, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry, and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right?" There's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right, actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty. One for me and one for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here, and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep-deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. Who started the fire? I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again, I scanned the faces staring back at me, all barely illuminated by the light from the fire, all familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall, dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. "Wait, I don't know," Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide, and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. "I think we should leave this place," Ava stuttered. "Yes, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it," Dave said. "But it's so dark out in the forest now. We'd probably get lost if we leave now," someone else said. "Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow," Eric agreed. I tried to protest, but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. "Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe," Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought one-person tents with us, but we could squeeze 2 if we tried. That way no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave, and Sally, like always, went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us, and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. "Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here?" Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. "There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and..." I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent, while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together, so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look over at the two tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking in Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it, his head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with a blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The five of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point, there were 3 of us running on the trail, Dave and I shoulder to shoulder while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my rib cage and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face, and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. Asterisk. I'm typing this post out at a rest stop. My phone has finally regained service, and I've called 911 to try and explain the situation. I don't think they believe my version of events, but they sent a car my way regardless. As I wait, the sun is finally starting to rise. After I hit the post button on this, I'm going to check why the person in my back seat has been so silent the whole time. Second story. The hunting trip. I just had to share this with someone. It doesn't make any sense. I got a call this morning. My boyfriend had been in some sort of hunting accident, and he was injured. They are not sure what happened. I got here, and he's still in ICU. They won't tell me anything. They gave me his things. Just his phone, wallet, and pocket knife. I powered on his phone to see if there is any clues as to what could have happened to him. There is a recent note saved on his phone. It might have some answers of what happened. Note: I'm going to start at the beginning. I don't know if anyone will ever read this. I just wanted there to be some record of what I've seen in this place. My name's Jeremiah Lapp. I thought I had found the perfect hunting spot, a little piece of public hunting land that seemed to be mostly undisturbed by people. Now as I sit here, I'm not sure where I am. I went in the day before opening day of whitetail season to set up the ladder stand. I set it up a few hundred yards in the woods. It was a bitch carrying that thing in, but I hoped it would be worth it. I was so excited I could hardly sleep that night. I arrived at the spot the next morning just before dawn. I snugged the door open and stepped out into the darkness, rifle in hand. I made my way in the dense woods. Every few steps I would stop, take the pen light out of my pocket, and shine it on the ground to make sure I was headed in the right direction. After the fourth time of almost falling on my face, I could make out the shape of the ladder in the dark. I shifted the rifle into my left hand and climbed up the ladder with one hand. The ladder was wet with dew and slippery. I sat down in the little padded seat. Damn, I should have tied the rifle to the paracord I have tied off at the top and pulled it up after I got up here. I'll remember that next time. That was kind of dangerous. I lifted the old Winchester I brought with me and pointed it down at the ground in a safe direction. I slid 4 fingers into the lever loop and pushed down, opening the action. There was just enough moonlight. I seen the glit of the metallic cartridge. I pulled the lever back up, closing the action. I put my thumb over the hammer tightly and pressed the trigger in order to slowly lower the hammer into the half-cock position. I was ready to go. It was just minutes before dawn. The chill that comes right before it's light out crept slowly through the woods, softly embracing all it meets in teeth chattering cold. The light had started to peek over the trees, but it was still fairly dark in the woods. I lay back on the tree and closed my eyes for a moment. It wouldn't be long now. After a few minutes, I opened my eyes and started to look around. Light was starting to trickle in. Suddenly, I was frozen in place by what I saw. About 20 yards in front of me was a huge buck, the biggest I had ever seen. My heart was in my throat, and I started to shake. The light hit his antlers, and they almost seemed to glow. I slowly moved the rifle into position and got the sights on him. I took a deep breath, and as I let it out, I slowly squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked in my hands and saw the buck stumble and to run deeper into the woods. I got him. I was bursting with excitement. I couldn't believe I really got him. I couldn't wait. I had to get down and find him. I could tell I had made a good shot, and he wouldn't make it far. I started to climb down the ladder. Just 2 feet from the ground, I slipped and fell off the ladder. I landed on my feet, but as soon as I landed, I heard a gunshot echo through the woods. It sounded close. Damn, someone must have seen my deer and shot at him again. I rushed in the direction of where I seen the buck run. I found the blood trail and started to follow it. From the amount of blood, he couldn't be too far. I made my way through the woods much further than I thought I would have to. Still no sign of the buck or any people. 2 things were starting to weigh on my mind. 1, this is crazy long blood trail. How is the buck still on his feet? 2, I've been walking for at least 45 minutes, but the sun hasn't moved. It's still exactly where it was when I shot. Light was peeking into the woods. Most of the sun still behind the horizon. I came over a hill to find a green canvas tent set up in a flat area surrounded by a few cedar trees. I walked down the hill to the campsite. Hello? I shouted, is anyone here? I'm looking for my buck. No answer, just birds chirping in the trees above. It was very strange for someone to be camping out here. I was fairly certain you were not allowed to during hunting season. They must not have got the memo. I walked over to a little folding table set up near the fire pit. On it was an old transistor radio and a Coleman lantern. Not a battery-powered LED lantern, like you see most people have these days, but real oil lantern. The ones you pump up and light. This thing is an antique, I thought as I lifted it off the table. I studied it for a moment, then sat it back on the table while muttering under my breath, "Hipsters." I walked over to the tent and leaned down to the opening. "Hello, is anyone here?" My voice was only met with more silence. So I peeked in the tent to see 2 empty sleeping bags and a few articles of random clothes laying around the tent. I guess no one's home. I walked out of the campsite, trying to pick up the blood trail again. Just a few steps away from the campsite, things got even stranger. I could see the woods stoped a little ahead. As I got closer, I could see what was a narrow dirt road weaving its way through the woods. There was a truck backed up to a bank on the side of the road. The way the truck was sitting, it was taking up the whole road. I walked towards the truck. When I was close, I could see it was an old International pickup. There was a large water tank in the bed, and now I could see the tank was catching spring water out of a mature spring. Only when I was at the hood of the truck did I see the man. He was tall and wore a felt hat. The hat was brown, probably dark brown at some point, but over the years the sun had faded it. He was lean, but looked strong for an old man. He looked to be in his mid to early 60s. He hadn't seen me walk up. "Excuse me, sir." The old man's head wiped around, surprised to see someone out here. His hand immediately went for the small of his back. I raised my hand in a symbol of peace. Even though one hand held a rifle, I spoke quickly and clearly. "I was just out doing some hunting, and I'm looking for my deer." The old man just started back at me. Getting a good look at him now, he looked oddly familiar, but I couldn't say where I had ever seen him. "Have you seen it?" I asked HM. Very slowly, he shook his head from side to side, not breaking eye contact with me. "Okay, well, I'll just be going then." This seems to ease him, and he let his arms fall to his side. I smiled while slowly lowering my hands. "I like the truck." I gestured towards the truck with the hand that wasn't holding the rifle. He still just stared back at me. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, but was probably just a minute, he spoke. "It's been a good one." His voice was deep and gravelly. It sounded like he hadn't said a word out loud for a long time. I shook my head up and down a little too enthusiastic. I was just happy he was responding. "I like the beard," he said, moving his hand over his salt and pepper stubble. I smiled and turned to look at my reflection in the passenger side window of the truck. There I stood, short and stocky, bushy mountain man's beard, but something was off. I moved closer to the truck window to make sure I was seeing clearly. My skin was ghostly pale. I touched my face, just trying to comprehend what I was seeing. I looked down at my hand, it was the same. I was brought out of my panic by the old man's voice. "I don't think you're going to find that buck." His voice was sort of somber now. I turned back to him. "Why not? Have you seen him?" I looked down the road for any sign of it. "No, I haven't seen it, but He trailed off and walked to the driver's side door of his truck. "You should know there is something following you." I turned back to the wood line I had emerged from. "What do you mean?" "What is following me?" It's different for everyone, so I'm not sure, but it's best just to go towards it rather than try and get away." "What the fuck are you talking about?" I shouted, full of confusion and irritation, but he didn't hear it. He had already sat down in the old workhorse and started the engine. He waved as he pulled away. "Crazy OL coot." I muttered as I back away from the dust cloud. What was he talking about, something following me? I had heard a twig or two snap behind me. I thought it was just a raccoon or a possum. I shook my head as if to sling the thought from my mind. I had now been walking an hour and a half, and the sun still isn't over the trees. I'll go back to the truck and get some water. I'll rest a while, then I'll come back and find the buck. I started back in the direction I came. Who knows, maybe I will find him on the way back to the truck. I walked back into the wood line. I headed back the way I had come. A twig snapped in the distance. I scanned the surrounding bush for movement. Damn, I'm losing it. Making my way back over the hill to the campsite I had come past, I was struck by what I saw. This was the way I had come. It couldn't be. The green canvas tent was torn to shreds. The little folding table where the lanterns were turned over. The lanterns lay broken on the ground. What the hell? I was just here. How could this have happened so fast? I was just 100 feet away from this spot, and I didn't hear anything. I heard a growl from just behind me. It was deep and low. I put my hand to my chest to still my heart that was beating its way out of my body. My hand touched something warm and wet. I pulled it away quickly to see it dripping with blood. What the fuck? I looked down, and I was standing in a pool of blood. I started to feel weak and tremble uncontrollably. I slowly turned around to see bloody footprints. My footprints. Before I could comprehend what was going on, a thrash in the shadows sent me sprinting through the woods. I ran unsure of the right direction, unsure of anything. My foot was caught on a tree root, and I fell into darkness. I opened my eyes, but my vision was blurry. I slowly stood, and the pain in my chest was terrible. Stumbling, confused, holding on to trees for support, hoping I was headed towards my truck. I could see a gap in the trees, and there was my truck sitting in a field. I took another step and was plunged into darkness. I could hear a faint crackling. I slowly opened my eyes. I was looking up at the night sky. The stars looked brighter than I had ever seen them. I turned my head to see a small fire. There, tending the fire, was the old man from the spring. I scrambled to my feet. Easy, son, easy. My eyes darted around for my rifle. Seeming to know what I was thinking, the man pointed just behind me and said, "It's there on the log." "What are you doing here?" "Meanwhile, I'm going to help you make it out of where the forest." "Yeah, kinda. Let me ask you some questions. How close was that second shot?" "I don't know. Couldn't have been more than a few yards away." At this, the old man just looked off into the distance for a while. "You seen any strange things since you've been looking for that buck?" "You mean besides you? And how do you know it was a buck? I just said deer earlier." The old man chuckled and pushed up his old felt hat to scratch his head. "Yeah, I am mighty strange to you, I expect. As for the buck, I know a lot of things, and I'm afraid I don't have time to explain it all to you." "Well, you don't have time for me to?" "What do you mean?" "We got to get going before it finds you." "Before what finds me?" "I don't have time to explain it to you, and you wouldn't believe me anyway. We have to get you to the river." "There's no river around here, is there?" "You'll see when we get there. You crossed it to get here, though you may not remember. You're tougher than I thought. I think you can make it back to the other side." With that, he turned and started through the brush. I quickened my pace to keep up with his long stride. "I think there might be some other people out here in trouble." "Why, did you see someone else?" "No, but there was a campsite, and 1 minute it was fine, and the next in shambles. You can't trust what you see out here. Anything you see has already happened. You can't help anyone." I started to speak, but he held his hand up to silence me. A gnarled old finger pointed to a briar patch a few feet away. I squinted, trying to see what he was showing me. Then the buck I shot stood up, but there was something terribly wrong. His eyes were ghosty white. Flies and all manner of insects surrounded a rotting bullet wound. I backed away. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The old man whispered, wait, but I turned to run. Before I could take a step, a large dark figure burst through the brush. I fell backwards, crawling away. A black bear stood on its hind legs before me. Its eyes were white like the buck's. The fur around his face was lighter than the rest. It seemed to make the shape of a gray skull. The skin on his lower jaw had rotted away, leaving nothing to cover his jagged, sharp teeth. A stream of blood and bile dripped from his mouth. The beast roared, and I felt frozen to the ground. He swiped a massive paw at me, and at the last second I was able to roll out of the way. I stumbled to my feet, and the bear charged. I looked around for help from the old man, but he was gone. At the last second, I flung myself out of the path of this terrible beast. I sprinted in what I hopped was the right direction. I could hear the bear tearing the brush behind me. Finally, I slid to a stop at a bank overlooking a river. Out of nowhere, the old man walked up beside me. "You have to go now. Are you sure this is the way?" "Yes." "Oh, and you'll need these to get across." He held out two strange-looking silver coins. I took them and looked over them. They looked old and well-worn. I could barely make out an owl on them. "Why would I nay dash dot?" Before I could finish, he pushed me into the river. The water was dark green, and it smelled of death. I was concerned for the old man, and I looked back to the bank. I could swear I seen him and the bear just sitting there watching me swim across. I made it to the other side and climbed out. As soon as I was out of the water, I felt so weak. I was at my truck in no time, it seemed. I got in and began to search my pockets for the keys. Shit, I must have dropped them out there. My eyelids started to get so heavy. I took my phone out and held it up. No signal. That's when I started this note. I hope someone find. Day 2. The doctors finally came and talked to me earlier this morning, and I got to see Jeremiah. The doctors say they are pretty sure he fell out of the tree stand while getting out. The rifle went off and shot him in the chest. They say he's very lucky to be alive. They think he might have wandered around out there for a while. One doctor pulled me aside and said he seems confused about what happened. Maybe it's the pain medication or the trauma of the whole thing. He said just give him time. I wanted to see him. I told him I read the note. He kept asking me if they found the old man or the bear. I told him there aren't really any bears around here. As for the man, no one lives within 10 miles of where you were found. He said the bear was right beside his truck roaring before they found him. I told him his head was against the steering wheel pushing the horn. That's how they found him. His delusion scares me a little. After a while of talking him through it, he seemed to accept he was hallucinating, that there was no bear, river, or old man. After just staring at the ceiling for a while, he looked over to the orange hazmat can in the corner. Sticking out was one sleeve of the flannel shirt he had been wearing. He asked me to get it for him. I don't think I'm supposed to, I told him, but he insisted. I opened the can and took out the shirt stained with dried blood. I asked him why he wanted it. He said just wait. He fished around in the front pocket and pulled out two of the strangest looking silver coins I've ever seen. Third story. If your voice stops echoing, cancel your road trip. I'm not saddened by the recent passing of my grandfather. Rather, I'm compelled to share the way I knew him best. I would not be here today if not for him. The entity came for me when I was 8 years old, and there was no way I would have survived if anyone else had been driving. My grandfather and I were on a fishing trip that day. My dad had intended to join us, but something had come up, so it was just the two of us for the first time. I was a little awkward around my grandfather because I'd never actually been alone with him. I'd always watched others interact with him, but had little to say myself because I was only 8. I was also in awe of how he was to my dad the way my dad was to me, namely a voice of authority. When my grandfather told me about the different types of fish and what baits to use, I listened like it was the most important thing in the world. It turned out to be a good thing that I took his words so seriously. That acceptance would later save my life. It began very innocuously. As we walked through a small gorge to get back to the car from the prime fishing spot, I could hear my grandfather's voice echo from the high rock walls. While he packed things into the car, I had several minutes to wander around, and I used them to run back to that area and shout. Strangely, my yell echoed only feebly once, and then not at all. Scream as I might, I heard no reflection of the noise. I was too young at the time to really understand how impossible that was. I just assumed I was yelling wrong somehow, or that my grandfather had a special grown-up timbre that allowed his voice to echo while mine just dropped off. Still, it bothered me, and I eventually brought it up on the drive back. Everything about that moment became seared into my memory. It was 3:22 in the afternoon by the clock in the car's dashboard. The sky was mostly clear with traces of white, and my grandfather's eyes were wide orbs of alarm turned upon me while his white knuckles tightened around the wheel. "What did you say, boy?" I asked how I can echo like you. I told him, suddenly afraid that I'd done something wrong. I yelled, and I couldn't echo. His face was normally crisscrossed with little lines that ran their way along relaxed, droopy skin. At that moment, his forehead and cheeks tightened to smoothness, and he scanned left and right rapidly. He didn't seem to find what he was looking for through the windows, but he did not seem reassured. "Here." He leaned over and opened the glove box in front of me to pull out a bag of jelly beans. I smiled for a moment, but he was not giving them to me as a gift the way he'd intended. "Eat them all?" I held the bag in my hands. It seemed a massive feast. If I'd been left to my own devices, I might have eaten them all eventually, but not all at once. "Why?" "Eat them all, boy," he said gruffly, his tone brooking no argument. I began stuffing the jelly beans in my mouth. He looked down and around, then at the back seat, then at his travel thermos in the cup holder between us. He thrust it into my hands to join the spilling bag of jelly beans. "Drink this. All of it. I'm not allowed to have coffee." I told him. "Mom," he cut me off. "Your mother will understand. Drink it. I know it tastes bad, but down it all." His gaze refocused on something beyond me, and I turned my head to my window to see the forested hills rolling by at various apparent speeds based on their distance. The furthest hills out on the horizon hardly seemed to be moving at all, but I thought I saw a tiny little speck atop one. My grandfather gripped my shoulder with one hand. "Drink, boy. Drink, and eat those jelly beans. You need the sugar and the caffeine. It's going to try to make you fall asleep. Don't let it." To say I was scared then would be an understatement. No part of me thought this was a prank of some sort. He was too reserved and austere a man for that. The coffee tasted horrible, but I gulped it down until none was left. After that, I began swallowing jelly beans whole until they were all gone. I looked to my right. The speck in the distance was still out there, but now one range of hills closer. It was still tiny, but now held movement akin to something waving back and forth. I looked to my grandfather in askance. He in turn looked away from the thing in the distance to focus on my face. He breathed in through his nose and turned forward, determined in a way I'd never seen him. His leg moved, and the car began to accelerate. We'd already been going the speed limit on the empty highway. The sugar, caffeine, and fear began to have an effect on me. I remember my cheeks and forehead warming and my hands growing clammy. I asked, "What's going on?" "I'm scared." "Be scared," he breathed, his eyes on the road as he continued to hit the gas. I could see the needle passing 80. "That'll help keep you awake. This thing, this godforsaken thing, it came for your grandmother, and it started the same way." Just before a long drive, we noticed her voice stopped echoing. His face contorted into a furious mask. But cars are a lot better now than they were back then. "I won't let it get you." My back began forcefully pressing into my seat as he put the gas to the floor. I watched the needle pass 90, and then I looked out the window again. It was even closer, now visible as the silhouette of a man running up hills, between trees, and over boulders parallel to us. It's still out there. My grandfather grunted angrily and audibly slammed his foot down. I held onto my armrest and the door handle in terror as our car topped 100 miles an hour and began to shake. It felt like we were in a barely controlled projectile far beyond any limit of safety, and I was terrified the highway would suddenly stop being empty and we would smash into a car or truck ahead. But even through that overwhelming fear and adrenaline, a chill tiredness began seeping up my spine. My eyes began to feel heavy, and I blearily looked to my right. The shock woke me back up. It was on the gravel shoulder of the highway now, completely visible as a black humanoid silhouette running at incredible speed alongside our car. In that moving pitch darkness, I could see lit pinpoints that made it feel as if I was gazing into the night itself. The afternoon sun burned in the sky above and behind it with no effect, staring as its blurred feet began to pelt across the painted line at the edge of the road. I felt sleepy again. It was running parallel to us, but drawing ever closer. "Wake up," my grandfather screamed, risking one hand off the wheel at 110 miles an hour to shake my shoulder. "It's trying to drain the life out of you. Wake up." He jerked the car one lane to the left, and, still pressed into my seat by the acceleration, I stared down at the hypnotic dashes in the middle of the road. Bit by bit, black feet began landing between each dash, keeping pace with us. I remember the car shaking violently around me the way I imagined a space shuttle lifting off might around its astronauts. I know now we were crossing 120 and nearing the most the car could offer, but at the time, I was caught in watching the hypnotic dashes and stars in those void legs moving rapidly back and forth as it ran right up alongside the car and reached down with one hand to open the door. Wind blasted around me as the gale force of 120-mile-an-hour winds tore at my clothing and hair. Waking up halfway, I screamed, and my grandfather jerked the car to the left again as much as he could without going off the road. It didn't matter. The running silhouette held the door open against the wind with its star-filled arm and began preparing to leap into the car with us. The other arm gripped my neck, and the cold that it brought cannot be described with mere words. The closest I can come is to say that the vast speeds and forces of an antithesis cosmos hated me. Somewhere ice and anti-life were the rule, moving through emptiness at absurd velocities, and this thing was some small part of that undead will. But it was not fully here. It could only interact with us in certain windows. That's what I believe now. My grandfather gave the only shout of fear I would ever hear from him as the car seemed to be shaking apart around us. I looked left at the speedometer, found the needle to be unreadably far out into the red, and felt the heavy blanket of sleep fall over me as the silhouette grasped repeatedly, but failed to reach me. The door slammed shut, cutting off the wind. Inch by inch, we began pulling away. It ran furiously alongside, but the entity was just a tiny bit too slow. Between one moment and the next, realizing it couldn't get us, it vanished. We'd escaped it. I awoke in a hospital several days later. My grandfather told nobody the real story, of course, but the doctors had plenty of diversion. Somehow, I'd been drained of a number of vital electrolytes, salts, and so on, and they chalked my coma up to some sort of severe dietary imbalance. But I knew the truth, and I've made sure to tell the people I care about the small piece of advice that my grandfather taught me. I don't care if it makes sense to you. Just listen. It's out there still in the open lands of the Midwest, and it's probably always been there. It was just never a problem before we started bringing great speeds into our daily lives. People die every day by falling asleep at the wheel, and I know for certain that not all of those incidents are innocent. If your voice stops echoing, cancel your road trip. It's waiting for you. Fourth story. I never should have come home early from my business trip. About 2 months ago, I left for about a week on a business trip. It's pretty typical for me to travel, and my wife and kids have gotten used to it. She'll usually take them out to eat when I'm gone, or to a museum or something fun to make it up to them. We often joke about how the kids are going to start liking me better when I'm away than when I'm at home. Anyways, One of our partners pulled out last second, and the meetings didn't take as long as we'd originally planned. Again, not unusual, but I decided that this time I wouldn't tell my wife. I thought I'd come home early and surprise them. Things didn't go exactly as planned. My connecting flight was canceled. I was rerouted, but had a 6-hour layover. Instead of getting home at 6 like I'd planned, I was looking at pulling into the airport at around midnight, which is still an hour drive from home. This wasn't terrible. They still had no idea I was coming, and it might surprise them even more if they woke up with me there. I got home, and the house was dark. It was a little after 1 o'clock when I arrived, so that was to be expected, but when I unlocked the door and slipped in quietly, the house felt empty. I slipped my shoes off and headed into the kitchen. This home is the first we've ever owned, and we've lived here for almost 4 years now. Tanya was only 3 when we moved in, and Michael had barely turned 6. The move had me exhausted, and the only thing I remember clearly from that day is Michael's excitement. It was the stairs. He ran up and slid down them on his stomach, what must have been 20 times before my Abby came in and put a stop to it, ranting about the carpet and how we needed to take care of it. I nodded and supported her, but I could honestly care less about the carpet. I had plenty of memories doing the exact same thing growing up. What I wanted then was a home for my children, somewhere they could make memories, somewhere they could feel safe, somewhere they could always return. From the moment he slid down those stairs, the house was that. But that night, as I walked into the kitchen, the house just didn't feel the same. Nothing was different, something just seemed wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck were on end, and I felt like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. I flipped the kitchen light on, and the feeling was pushed back a bit by the light bathing the familiar landscape. I lingered, not because I was hungry, simply because I didn't want to turn the lights back off. I just sat there reading the paper until I couldn't justify staying awake any longer. I flipped the kitchen light off, and the hairs on my neck immediately perked back up. The feeling of intrusion returned. I flipped the light back on. I walked over to the next room and turned the light in the living room on before switching the kitchen lights back off. I did the same for the stairs and the hallway, just like I had when I was a kid. It felt childish, but for whatever reason, I just didn't feel safe in my own home. I reached my room, and I braced myself to flip the final light off. I did so and slipped quickly through my door. It was dark, and I stumbled over a stool as I made my way across the room. My instincts worried about a hand reaching out from under the bed and grabbing my ankle, but my brain told me it was an irrational fear. I knew that if anything were to happen to me, it wouldn't be from monsters, and it would have happened before I'd made it home. I could hear Abby's shallow breathing drift from the bed, and I focused on that. It was comforting just to have her there in the room with me. I honestly don't know what my sleeping wife would have been able to do in the case of any danger, but her presence was peaceful. I focused on her breathing and hurried to change my clothes, sneaking into bed and under the covers. I was safe just like when I was a kid. The covers seemed to offset any outside danger or worry. The effect was even more so with somebody else in the bed, especially her. Abby'd always had a way of easing my worries. We first met in college during the most difficult semester of my life. I was taking various upper-level accounting classes and was drowning in assignments. I first saw her in the library, and I couldn't focus until she'd agreed to let me take her to lunch. I don't know where I found the time, but we saw each other almost every day after that. Most days we would just sit and study, and the most effective work I ever did was done to the sound of her snores. I snuggled up next to my wife and let her breaths lull me once more into a state of comfort, and then to sleep. I woke up the next morning to an empty bed in a quiet house. It was almost 11 o'clock, so I assumed she'd gone off to run errands after the kids left for school. I fiddled around in bed on my phone, scrolling through social media, until I saw something that made my blood run cold. My first call was to Abby, my second. Less than a minute later, was to the cops. They arrived in minutes. I told them what happened and showed them what I'd seen. It was a picture of my family. Michael was climbing on the furniture, and Tanya was playing on the floor in a familiar background. Abby was in the foreground with her arm around her sister. The timestamp on the photo was from 11:46 the night before. My sister-in-law lives 3 hours away. I still have no idea who was in my bed that night. Fifth story. A field trip to remember. Lloyd Dobson, my middle school bully, was the first one to see it. Had the circumstances been different, I doubt anyone would have believed what happened, though it was undeniable we encountered something on that trip. He and his buddy, Ray Mathers, put me through hell for years. Me and the only friends I had, along with anyone else who was unfortunate enough to have been born smaller and weaker than them. I didn't even see Lloyd until it was all over. The events that still weigh heavily on my subconscious. I barely registered the condition he was in at the time, given the fact that I was out of it myself. After I heard the whole story, though, I never would have wished that on anyone, even if they had made life hard for me for years. It was mid-March of 2014, with only a few months of 8th grade left, when we took that field trip. It was a fairly small school I attended back then, with even the full graduating classes consisting of maybe 30 to 40 students in all. The high school was in another complex, but it shared the grounds with the junior high and kindergarten, which was one of the reasons I could never escape my bullies. I remember begging my parents to send me to a different school, but that would have required moving to a different town altogether, something they couldn't afford to do on a whim. I was well aware of that, even when I would spend hours crying after getting off the bus, but I still hoped things could have been different. I never held it against my folks. Mind you, they did everything in their power. They both kicked up a fuss at the school, threatened lawsuits, and the like if Principal Marks didn't address the problem, but that only made things worse. Yeah, they calmed down for a few weeks after Marks read them the riot act, but after a while, they got back to it, far more relentless than ever. I pretended things had gotten better to my parents, playing off the cuts and bruises as playground accidents and the like, but I knew they knew things weren't great. Dad had dealt with bullies when he was a kid, so he likely had a good idea of what was going on, but I convinced them not to pay another visit to the school. I dreaded to think how bad it would have gotten if they had called in reinforcements and all. Jace Banks and Bella Swean were the only friends I had through kindergarten and middle school, so we sat together on the bus as we headed out to Lake Sakakawea. It was only a 30-minute trip to get there from our small North Dakota town middle school, but that was more than enough time for Lloyd and Ray to give us a quick preview of the fun they had in store for us. While I had been out to the lake before, given that there wasn't much of anything else of interest nearby, even familiar places were so much more exciting when they were taking the place of some hours spent at school. Of course, it would surely have been more fun without the company of the biggest asshats in our class, but that didn't take away from my excitement. Most of the other kids were cutting up or gazing out the windows at the beautiful scenery, but while we attempted to keep to ourselves, the constant barrage of spit wads and smack talk kept us from being able to relax and enjoy the ride. Gabriel Baker, our homeroom teacher who sat at the front of the bus, tried his best to turn a blind eye to the loud teens at his rear, but he would make regular empty threats in a meager attempt to calm things down. He was always a pushover, Mr. Baker, so everyone knew he wasn't about to have the driver turn this damn bus around, regardless of the visible vein throbbing above his temple. If I couldn't take him seriously, I knew Mathers and Dobson wouldn't either. We still laughed and joked about all of the things that made us freaks in the eyes of our peers, regardless of the endless mockery. Even if the trip felt a good deal longer than the 30 minutes or so that had gone by, we were pulling up to the parking area off to the side of the lake before we knew it. I felt my face burn when Ray pushed Bella down the steps as she walked off the bus, but Jace caught her before her face planted into the gravel. Fortunately, Baker actually paid attention to what happened, looking as flushed as I felt at the time. He warned the chuckling duo of douchebags that he would be keeping an eye on them, and even though they laughed the whole thing off, they surprisingly kept their distance from us after that. Sure, we could see them staring at us, talking shit from a distance over the next hour or so, but I wasn't about to allow them to stop me from having a good time. For a school field trip, it was actually quite relaxed. We didn't have any sort of itinerary or anything, no obligations, or chosen path to follow. We weren't even required to stay in a huddle, so everyone scattered to their normal groups, taking in the beautiful scenery. It wasn't until a couple of hours had passed, as Baker was asking around about Ray and Lloyd's whereabouts, that I even noticed they had disappeared. They probably just snuck off to smoke, Bella said, rolling her eyes. Maybe we'll get lucky and they'll find him drowned or something, Jace said, giving us a laugh. Normally, I wasn't one to wish anything bad on anyone, even those I don't care for, but I wouldn't lose a wink of sleep if either of those two pricks had washed up dead on the riverbank. In the end, I think that may have been a better outcome than what happened. I can't believe I'm saying this, but even Lloyd Dobson didn't deserve that. After another 45 minutes passed by with no trace of the two bigger kids, Baker looked like he was getting pretty concerned. Regardless of whether or not the school, and the world for that matter, would be a better place without them, they were under his watch. There's no denying he'd be in a shit ton of trouble if he lost any of the teens who were in his care, even those who were likely to grow up to be the next Gacy or Dahmer. Our teacher gathered up the rest of us and made us stay together while he took a head count to make sure Dobson and Mathers were the only two unaccounted for. Once he was satisfied, he and Umber, the bus driver, headed out to search for the missing asshats. Those two always got to be the center of attention, Jace said, shaking his head with his eyes rolling. Hopefully, I said almost under my breath, they found a hill to tumble down and broke every damn bone in their bodies. Damn, dude, Bella said with a chuckle. Little harsh, huh? Wouldn't hurt my feelings a bit, I said bluntly. Sure, I felt a little embarrassed when Bella called me out, especially since she only laughed when Jace made the crack about them drowning. But those two could go to hell for all I cared. They had gone to great lengths to make life miserable for any of the weaker kids, ever since kindergarten. Even if their home life was a train wreck, inspiring them to lash out in any way they could wasn't my problem. All I knew was that I hated them with the passion of 1,000 suns. That was until the screaming began. I couldn't tell if it was Ray or Lloyd who made that horrified shriek. It may have been Baker of Umber, for all I could tell from the sound of it. Whoever it was, it silenced every one of us who remained huddled in the group, awaiting our teacher's return. "O.H. God," a voice howled from a distance. "For Christ's sake, help me." There was murmuring through the group, accompanied by wide eyes and shocked expressions. While nobody exactly jumped at the opportunity to assist whoever was yelling out, I can't deny that my curiosity was practically bubbling over. When I ran for the treeline, intent on seeking out the source of the terrified wailing, I can't honestly say where my mind was at the time. For some reason, I didn't even factor in that the assholes could be playing some sort of prank, just to make me look stupid in front of everyone. I think my curiosity overruled my common sense at the time. My instincts took the wheel, not allowing me to give it a second thought. I heard my friends call out to me as I sprinted between the trees, but I was so focused on that haunting sound, I paid little attention to them. Even after the screams softened to more of a constant moaning, I could tell it wasn't far ahead. As I drew closer to another parting in the trees, one that looked as though it led to another section of the lake we came to visit, I allowed the throbbing in my side to slow my approach. "What the hell, man?" Jace said as he and Bella came up behind me. "You nuts?" Bella asked, panting for breath. "You don't run towards shit like this, dingus." "But what if they're hurt?" I said, choosing not to reveal the other side of my reasoning for running this way. "Then we call someone, 911 or some shit. We don't go looking for trouble, Billy," Jace said, slugging me on the shoulder. With that whimpering just ahead, maybe 20 or 30 feet off, if I had to guess, I just looked in the direction I was heading, then back at my friends. They both looked lost for words, glancing at one another, seemingly having some sort of silent debate, before Bella gave a shuddering sigh. "Okay," she said, "but if you get me killed, I'm kicking your ass." Leading the way, I pushed through the brush between the trees, stepping out to the riverbank. Baker, it seems, was the one providing the ambient moaning, as he writhed on the gravelly ground, holding his hands over his eyes. He didn't look hurt. Not that I could tell anyway, but there was definitely something wrong with him. I crouched down beside him, laying a hand on his shoulder, which he instantly jerked himself away from, scraping his legs against the ground to push his body from me. With another attempted touch of my hand, he began to scream again, folding himself into the fetal position with his back to me. "Mr. Baker, it's me, Billy Johnson, your student. What's—" "Don't touch me," he yelled, again scraping his body across the ground, flopping around like a fish out of water. "What the actual—" Jay said before his words trailed off. When I turned to see him staring at the water, steadily inching towards it, I couldn't tell what had inspired his eyes to grow so large and his jaw to fall limp. "It's coming back," Baker said, his screams replaced by mad laughter. "You'll see." "What?" I turned to look at the man who had finally raised himself, almost stunned as his hands slipped from his face. "Then you won't?" I felt my jaw unhinge when I saw the blank and lifeless, milky white eyes of my homeroom teacher, staring into oblivion. The skin around his eyelids was torn and split from where it looked as though his fingernails had dug into the flesh, but there was nothing behind his empty gaze. "What is that?" Jace asked from somewhere outside my erratic thoughts. When I looked up to see him and Bella both, gazing almost entranced at the water, I turned to see what had their undivided attention. When my eyes met the almost hypnotic, vibrant red that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, I was barely aware of getting back to my feet to join my friends as they paced toward the rapids. "No," a voice called out, almost pulling my transfixed glare from the eerie, yet beautiful sight, as something began to rise from beneath the rippling surface of the lake. Something I still steadily approached. I felt my body colliding with the ground once more, with the wind knocked out of me. Whether my legs had somehow given out at the sight of whatever was freeing itself from the water, or that something else left me splayed out on the gravel, coughing and wheezing, I didn't know at the time. Either way, once my eyes were distracted from the mesmerizing sight, I felt my senses begin to return. "Don't look at it," a familiar voice said, pushing me back on my ass before I could pick myself back up. "What the fuck, dude?" Bella barked, having joined me on the ground at some point. A thick and muscled arm wrapped around me, while another shielded my friend from whatever was happening. When I heard a howling sound of madness, emitting from the mouth of the friend who did not share my company on the ground, I fought against the one who held me in place, desperate to reach Jace. "Oh God! Oh Jesus!" My friend whimpered before another shrill squeal echoed from his mouth. Let me go, I begged, battling harder against my subduer with every word. You can't, he said. You can't look at it? But, Jace, he's already gone. Too late for him now. It'll be over in a moment. Just, no. I screamed, launching my knee into the gut of whoever held me on the ground. As a horrendous roaring sound joined the horrified wails of my friend, I felt my legs betray me as I attempted to lift myself back up. When I noticed it was Ray Mathers who still tried to pull me back down to where he crouched, holding a writhing Bello in place, I grew certain this was some bizarre stunt or prank designed to make us feel like idiots when the curtain was pulled back. With that, I was more determined than ever to reach Jace, worried he was caught in the middle of some cruel joke performed by the other half of our duet of tormentors. What the hell are you guys playing at now? I asked, finally breaking free of his grasp. This shit ain't funny, you. I didn't know where the attack came from, but whatever caught me across the jaw left my head loopy and my eyes crossed for a time. When I spun in place, wrestling to remain on feet that felt disconnected from my body, I could barely believe what my faltering vision revealed. My mind was dazed from the hit. My thoughts were all over the place. But even through my blurred and unfocused sight at the time, I couldn't even hope to rationalize the thing that stood waist deep in the water. Jace had dropped to the ground, still screaming and writhing in place, just as we had found Mr. Baker. But the creature just gazed back at us, barely moving. Maybe it was just my reeling and jarred consciousness that inspired some bizarre hallucination, but my shell-shocked brain could barely wrap around the sight of this thing. It stood the height of a tall person, lean, yet muscled, its every inch layered with brownish-red hair. The face was long and gaunt, with longer hair hanging like a beard on its chin and from the top of its head, with a single, glowing, orange eye dead in the center of its forehead. A long horn protruded from directly above it, like an extended brow, twisting and coiled like a static serpent. Were it not for the impending dizziness, brought on by whatever left my jaw swelling, I can only imagine what effect the sight of this thing could have had on me. Likely, I would be in a similar state as my teacher and friend, who still contorted their bodies against the gravel, moaning in shared anguish. Just as I began to feel the loopiness completely numb the senses it had muted, I saw the creature turn away from me, lowering back into the water. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the sight of the jagged, saw-like spine that pushed through the back of the monster. It was like a grotesque fin that carved through the water like a hot knife through butter as it drifted away. When my eyes reopened, or I should say, when they were forced back open by the paramedics shining the light on them, it took me a moment to relocate my bearings. From what I could tell, I had been moved away from the water, though I could still hear it rushing from somewhere in the background. "Can you tell me your name?" the medic asked, turning his light off while I blinked my eyes. Billy Johnson, what? Do you know where you are? How you got here?" "We're on a field trip." "Who?" "This one's lucid." He called to someone else before a stocky, balding police officer came strolling up beside him. I could see more paramedics working on the others, but Lloyd and Umber looked as catatonic as Jace and Baker. At the time, I could only speculate as to what had happened to them, as I had only been present for my friend losing his shit, but it would all be revealed soon enough. Though I was still somewhat out of it, I answered the officer's questions to the best of my ability, recounting the events that still felt vague and scattered at best. Was no easy task, but the more we spoke, the more my senses returned. I would have to recall this tale to others over the hours and days that followed, along with Bella and Ray, but it would be some time before we were informed about the fate of our teacher and friends. According to Ray, he and his friend had been walking the riverbank, having snuck away from the rest of the class a while back, when Lloyd began to act strangely, stopping in place to gaze at the water with his body trembling. Ray turned to see him transfixed by the reddening water. He got in front of his friend, shaking him violently in an effort to break his unwavering focus. But when he heard the roaring sound from behind him, he turned, allowing only his periphery to see the creature emerging from the lake. When Lloyd shrieked at the sight of this thing, Ray whipped his attention back to the one before him, refusing to permit his eyes to meet what he feared to be creeping up on him from behind. As his friend fell to the ground, Umber broke through the tree lean, his legs immediately paralyzed by the sight of the monster, as his screams joined Lloyd's. At that, Ray ran for it, wasting no time in attempting to preserve his life, regardless of the state his friend was in at the time. I could tell he was ashamed of his actions while he recounted them, but I couldn't blame him. There was nothing he could have done, after all. He hid in the bushes between the trees, trembling from head to toe, terrified that the creature would seek him out. Having no idea how long he stayed there, nestled away in the brush, he couldn't tell how much time had passed when he heard Baker howling from somewhere to his left. It wasn't until he watched my friends and me approaching from a distance that he finally convinced himself to take action. By the time he arrived at the scene, Jace was already mesmerized by the sight of the thing rising from the lake, so he tackled Bella and me, the only two he thought he could save. When I broke free of his grip, the only thing he could think to do was clock me as hard as he could. "Better bruised than whatever happened to Lloyd," he said, wearing an apologetic expression. Even with everything he and Lloyd had put me through over the years, I couldn't hold it against him. Had he not left my head spinning, I would surely have ended up in the same condition as the others. Gabriel Baker, a husband and father to 3 children, died on the way to the hospital. Lloyd Dobson and Jace Banks both lasted a day or two before they too lost the fight. Benjamin Umber, a widower and father to a 20-year-old son, remains in a mental facility to this day. All 4 of those who clearly saw the creature were blinded by the time the ambulance arrived, but autopsies showed no reason for that or the apparent heart attacks that put a premature end to their lives. Umber will likely live out his days in that facility, days that are numbered from what I've heard. His health has been deteriorating for some time now. Rumor has it the doctors feel his journey is coming to an end soon. Why he lasted so much longer than the others, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps it was simply the fact that he was further back from the lake when he saw it. Supposedly, he had left his glasses on the bus, and his vision wasn't the best before he lost his sight completely. Whatever the case, it seems that the creature got the better of him in the end. If nothing else, maybe in death he'll finally be freed from his torment. It wasn't long after I returned to my home that I finally got my wish. We moved away from that town to somewhere with no rivers or lakes for miles. Even now, I try to avoid coming close to anything like that. Hell, I break out in a cold sweat if I see a damn swimming pool, let alone anything not crafted by human hands. Last I heard, Ray is of the same mindset as I, that it's in our best interest to remain on dry land. Bella and I drifted apart after that day, as she blamed me for what happened to Jace. In all honesty, I carry the burden of his death to this day. It was my damn curiosity that put us in the crosshairs of that thing. Surprisingly, I grew closer to my former bully after the events that left us haunted and broken. We have our trauma and guilt in common, as well as the frequent nightmares that revisit that ill-fated field trip and those we lost that day. I live in fear that someday the image of that monster my subconscious still holds will be enough to end my life, as it did my friends on that field trip what feels like a lifetime ago. While I have no way of understanding why it chose to only reveal itself from a distance, rather than breaking free of the water to finish us off in a more physical manner, I would be a fool to believe I can understand the motivations of such a creature. Just be careful when you visit the lakes and rivers of the world. If you see a shimmering red illuminating from beneath the rippling water, don't stick around to see what happens next. If you do, it may just be the last thing you ever see before the lights go out completely. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.